guys, welcome back. So we are going to pick up with ancient Egyptian economics today. Yesterday you should have done one of the two articles either on pyramids of Egypt or Egyptian dynasties. Today we're going to pick up and look at economics of ancient Egypt. This one shouldn't take us too terribly long because normally economics is a pretty short section in our notes. And I think it's only like 5 slides, so it shouldn't take us too terribly long as Ms. Bosnego doesn't get extra long-winded. So let's hop on here. Looking at the economy of ancient Egypt. So the ancient Egyptians, just like with China and with Mesopotamia and most ancient civilizations that don't move, so they're not nomadic, they stay in one place, their economy was based around farming and fishing. The two big things. Farming, of course, there's very fertile soil around the Nile, so farming obviously makes sense. We're going to farm. If we have the land, you might as well farm it. So farming was a big thing. And then fishing. Fishing was really easy. A lot of ancient civilizations begin with fishing because it's pretty easy. You go in, there's fish there by the river, you catch them. Egypt is based around the Nile, obviously, so there's fish there, but there's also fish in the Mediterranean up to the north and to the Red Sea, which is more like southeast-ish. So there's different bodies of water around the Nile, obviously, so fishing and farming were big parts of ancient Egypt. So also, another similar thing between Egypt and China is the way that they dealt with farming. So lower class peasants would farm the land. Just like we saw in China, the peasants or the farming class would be the ones that would do that farming. They would work the land and they would grow wheat was one crop that was grown there. Also barley was grown and papyrus. So those peasants would work the land. They'd grow these kinds of crops. Rice was not grown in Egypt. Rice is pretty unique to China and Southeast Asia because of all the rain that they get. But wheat, barley, and papyrus. And we talked about papyrus a little bit already when we looked at the achievements of ancient Egypt, because we talked about how papyrus then eventually made papyrus scrolls, which is what they would write on to record their history and the Book of the Dead and things like that. The papyrus is a reed, and that reed then can be used to make the papyrus paper. Landowners. So the peasants didn't own the land that they worked on. It was owned by upper class people that had more money. They would own the land. The peasants would work it. The landowners would then keep some of the items that was grown and give the rest to the government. So what I think is kind of interesting about ancient Egypt is the way that they distributed their crops. So rather than whatever you grew, you kept, and then gave part to the government as a tax, and the government kept it, they would collect the majority of what was grown. So the landowners would keep a little bit of it, the peasants would keep very little of it, the rest would be given to the government, and then the government would distribute out the food to people who didn't work the land. So like your merchants, your traders, your artisans, your upper class people who maybe didn't own a farmland, maybe they own like an estate somewhere or something, so they would collect all that food and then distribute it out to the people. In addition to farming and fishing, trading was also super important in ancient Egypt, as with most ancient civilizations. I'm not telling you something you don't already know. It made the civilization more profitable, more money. So we have the Silk Road that starts to kind of invade in to Egypt at a certain point. It started in China, obviously. It travels all the way over and it gets into Egypt. Some of these red lines here are part of the Silk Road. Now, not all of it is, only some of them. But we see that we have some red trade routes here on land. We have some through the water. Different things were traded in different places. But trading was important because it helped you get things that you didn't have. So the Egyptians would give things like gold, wheat, and linen. So they would make like linen cloth. So they would give gold, wheat, and linen in exchange for, or so they would get things like wood. There's not a lot of trees that grow in this area. They're in the middle of the desert, so they need wood to build houses and things. So wood, ivory, there's not a lot of elephants and stuff in this area, so ivory really couldn't be mined, I guess, or collected. So they'd have to trade for it. They'd also trade for iron, copper, and spices. So we know spices more than likely probably came from China, but there are other areas that had spices as well. So all of these things were important in Egypt. And it's important to point out that the Egyptians had gold, wheat, and linen, and they traded it for wood, ivory, iron, copper, and then underneath there is spices. So trading was big too. So, in addition to this, we have a canal that was built. So we know that in the Middle Kingdom, the pharaohs begin kind of reining in the Nile. So the Nile's flooding. It's not that it's really out of control, but it's pretty disruptive. So we start trying to find ways to deal with the flooding in the Nile and to get water where it needs to go. So a canal was one way of doing this. There's a pretty famous canal that was built from the Nile River. So it starts in the Nile and it goes to the Red Sea. And it made transportation easier. So I'm going to go back for just a second here. So you can kind of see where this would have been. So we have the Red Sea here. And we have the Nile, which is really hard to see, but it's like this like blue-ish kind of thing. It's underneath that red. That red is part of the Nile. So it would have been a canal, and it would have reached, I think it was in this area, reached across over into the Red Sea. So this transportation from the Nile to the Red Sea just made things easier. It made it easier. Rather than having to take this long trip over land, we could now go straight through in this canal using water. And this canal was called the Canal of the Pharaohs. So, this very important canal, very big thing that came out of Egypt. And this canal actually is still used today. Later it becomes the Suez Canal, which is still in use today. I have some pictures here on the next slide that I'm going to show you. But the Suez Canal is a pretty famous canal, kind of like on the same level as like the Panama Canal, if you've ever heard of the Panama Canal before. But it starts out as the Canal of the Pharaohs, eventually becomes the Suez Canal, and is still in use today. It was used back then, still used to trade goods across rather than having to take the long land paths. So here's where the Canal of the Pharaohs starts. So it starts here, kind of at the very bottom of the delta. If you remember, that delta is that like fingers that come up from the river, and all this fertile soil through here. So it starts kind of here in zigzag, and it goes down and into this kind of part of the Red Sea. Now the Red Sea continues to kind of go down. All these little lakes together kind of form the Red Sea. There are more of the Red Sea is down here. But it goes here into this, and so then there's more of the canal that feeds then into the actual Red Sea. So we go from the Nile River into the Bitter Lakes, which then goes into the Red Sea. Today it looks like this. It's, like I said, still being used today. It's called the Suez Canal now, but you have big trade cargo ships that would carry things from the Nile down to the Red Sea and then over across to wherever it needs to go. But it is still in use today, which is kind of cool. So the last thing we're going to talk about is the fact that the Pharaoh owned everything. Okay? Remember, it's believed that the Pharaoh is a descendant of the gods, so it was important to make the Pharaoh happy. And the Pharaoh owned everything in the land. Like, he could go down in the city and be like, this is mine, and he could take it, and no one could be like, no, you're stealing from me, because technically everything is his, or hers if it was a woman. So the Pharaoh owned everything, and because of that, the Pharaoh forced people to pay taxes in the form of grain or other goods and services. So again, this goes along with that fact that everything was collected and then redistributed out. Because the Pharaoh owned everything, he was able to do with the grain as he wanted. So he could give certain groups of people more grain than others if need be. He could choose not to give any grain at all to certain people. It kind of depended on the Pharaoh and what he or she believed and how to do that, whether he or she was a good, fair Pharaoh or a cruel Pharaoh. Regardless, the Pharaoh owned everything. So he or she was able to do whatever she wanted with it. Or he wanted with it. And he did this through taxes in the form of grain and other things. Not a lot of money itself was exchanged. There was money that was exchanged as the civilization continued to grow. But especially right at the beginning, not a lot of money was exchanged. It was mostly like a barter system. So hopefully you remember what a barter system is from Mesopotamia. that is it. So we're going to stop there. Make sure you have all of your notes kind of filled in. The next video is going to be on social structure in Egypt. It's going to be our last video for social studies. So hopefully you're ready for that. I will let you guys go and continue on with your day. If I can find my mouse, there we go. All right, bye guys.